Welcome back to the Pursuit Podcast. I'm your host, Jessica Rose. Throughout the month in February, we're going to be having guests on to talk about different aspects of learning something new, with an early focus this month on learning to code. Today's guest is going to be talking to us about how he learned to code while blind. I'm here today with
Parham Doustdar. I'm a backend developer and I mostly do server-side programming, mostly because I'm a blind developer and I can't really use CSS and HTML and JavaScript. So it makes sense only to do backend development.
And all throughout February, we're talking with different guests about different aspects of learning a new skill or learning to code. And I was really excited to come and talk to you about what's it like to learn to code when you're blind?
Yeah, that's a really awesome question because it's not something that a lot of people really talk about. Just like any other kind of learning process, you need to start with niching down and understanding how you actually learn. So one of the problems you will face as a blind developer, for example, is that there is not much research into how you can learn new concepts or like how your learning style might differ from someone who can see. So you need to figure this out as you go yourself. So like, for example, if you go and buy a book about how to develop with Java, like do backend development with Java, you will inevitably have chapters where they talk about CSS and HTML and JavaScript. And you will have to figure out how you can jump through them without detracting from your learning experience, without missing all the important bits and pieces.
Parham, that's such an interesting point that when you start learning for the first time and you're from a group of learners that's not really well served by the learning material, you don't just have to go and source the learning material, but you've also kind of got to think about how to build your own learning experiences.
Yes, that's totally true. And it becomes more and more important because, so like I'm speaking from a blind person's point of view here, but mostly when you're going through the traditional learning system of school or university, no one really tells you how to pinpoint your way of learning. Because what people usually do is they have their own learning material that is created for them. So for example, everything is created for people who are sighted. So if you're sighted, you probably have 3 learning styles and that's it. And everything is probably ready to go for you. But the problem is that when you fall outside of this zone, now you have to go and figure this stuff out for yourself. And a lot of this stuff is really new and like uncharted territory. So that's why a lot of blind people, even though programming is not really an inaccessible thing, a lot of blind people don't really make it into the tech industry because they just don't know where to start. There's so much material that you have to go through before you really understand what is useful and what is not useful, or like what kind of niche should you go into? Should I go into like web development? If yes, should I learn with front-end development? And a lot of this stuff is just preventing people from getting in and starting to learn development, even though it's very doable. So that's why it's stopping a lot of people from starting their career.
So this is incredibly interesting to me. We focus a lot within technology and within development on making our products more accessible. But speaking to you, it sounds like we've failed on a very fundamental level to make access to working and building these products accessible.
Yes, and part of it is because, minorities are always minorities. But yes, it's always been something that I have had to find my own way through. And it's not only in the tech industry, it's in a lot of learning material. So like, for example, just to give you an example outside of the tech field, but something that is totally very useful for developers to learn is communication. So like when you pick up any communication book, the first thing everyone agrees on is 60% of all conversations are body language. And yeah, when you want to get into learning about, when you want to learn any communication styles or anything, you just have to barrel through all that 60% of body language and try to figure out, okay, now that I don't have the ability to use body language, what can I use as a replacement? And you're pretty much left onto your own devices. And that's something that I have, for example, in the past struggled with. Like soft skills didn't used to be my strong point in the past. And most of it was also because it's pretty hard to get into any field without actually having the ability to see, because a lot of that content is created for people who have the benefit of seeing.
And I think looking at that in that perspective, saying, you know what, we've had a largely sighted industry building not just products for ourselves, but also access to and learning environments for ourselves. It seems, yeah, unnecessarily selfish.
Yes, that's true, but also to try and also take the devil's advocate side here, part of it is that there is no awareness. So last year, I think like 1 year and 4 or 5 months ago, I got hired in booking.com. And at the time, before I joined Booking, I actually tried to book my honeymoon through the Booking website. And it was a very sneaky honeymoon. So I had just gotten married.
Congratulations.
Yay, thank you. So I just wanted to sneakily book a hotel and just go for it. But I couldn't. And I couldn't really ask anyone else to come in because then it wouldn't be a surprise anymore, right?
Yeah.
So I failed to completely do it. And then when I got hired into Booking, I realized, oh, these people have totally no idea that there are blind people and they're like, they travel and they move around and they want to book hotels too. And once I actually got this point across that, hey, there is a community of people and we're guessing that, like, just to give you an approximation, like 6 million of booking.com users might be blind, then everyone was like, huh, how can we actually pay attention to these people? So like once you actually go up to people and raise the opportunity for them to learn about different kinds of accessibility issues, like people with physical disabilities, people with learning disabilities, once you actually do this, people are usually very receptive. The problem is that this awareness is not raised anywhere early enough. So like, for example, if you go to a bootcamp, a coding bootcamp, they don't tell you, hey, here is how to make your website accessible. They say, hey, here is how you program in Python and get this done in 2 weeks instead of, I don't know, 2 months. It's just that accessibility is not really a part of the curriculum yet. So no one knows about it. But once people do, I've seen that people are usually very receptive. Like, how can I do this? How can I improve? For example, iOS developers, iPhone has a screen reader called VoiceOver. And a lot of iOS developers have no idea such a feature exists. It's like saying, I don't know that iOS has a settings app that you can go and change. So, I mean, like, it's a very integral part of the operating system. But the problem is no one actually told these people that such a thing exists. And once you actually know about it, once you search VoiceOver or accessibility for iOS, there's like a huge resource on the apple.com website, but it's just that no one knows it's there.
And it sounds like building with a diverse team. So building with teams where people might have accessibility needs or might be really aware of that, like getting you onto the booking.com team seemed to be a really good way to get them aware of what they needed to fix.
Yes. Mostly it's also because you can look to the person next to you. And now it's not just a remote person somewhere that I haven't actually met before, right? Like, for example, when you say there has been an earthquake somewhere and 50 people have died or something like that, there has been a study about this that people just don't connect to this number. It's just a 50. But like when it is the city next to you, now it starts to make more sense. Like, ooh, now like all these people with all these families and all these wishes that they had. And so like once you have a team member that also has their own accessibility needs, it just brings the whole point closer to home. So you're like, oh, it could be this person.
So when we first started talking about the challenges behind learning to code and getting into development while blind, you gave an example of using a textbook and having to sort of mentally filter out the CSS stuff or pieces that weren't relevant, pieces that didn't make sense. Can you talk a little bit about how you yourself learned? Did you learn from a textbook?
My learning style is mostly through projects. I understand something when I can understand how to apply it in everyday life. So, for example, if you give me a science textbook that talks about stuff that I don't really get to use every day, I will never get to learn it. But if you tell me about physics and how when I let go of an object, the gravity makes it like fall onto the ground, now it makes total sense. So knowing this and having figured this out the hard way, For me, it was mostly getting textbooks that were explaining the development. Like, for example, I started with PHP. For me, it was like find a book about PHP or find books on a PHP framework that tell you how to start writing a project from start to finish in that framework or in that language. All these projects, of course, had a presentational layer. For me, for example, because I was doing PHP, it was like, okay, so once you get the backend code for this running, here is how you put the HTML and CSS. But once I figured out that my learning style is like this, I usually went for books that said, just copy paste this code for HTML and CSS and just, I don't really. You get that a lot in, for example, Rails books where, if I remember right, there is a really famous book on Rails, the Rails tutorial, and it's a free book and you can also buy it. It actually says, I don't really want to explain much HTML and CSS here, just copy paste this. And it was like heaven for me, like, yay, okay. I don't have to understand all these blocks if I don't want to. But the truth of the matter is, if you want to go and work with a team that is a full stack team, as in like you have front-end developers and you have back-end developers, you need to kind of understand the general idea behind HTML. Like, why do we even have HTML? Why aren't we using style tags in HTML? And why do we have CSS instead? As long as you understand these general points and guidelines and the reason behind everything existing in this tech stack, you should be fine. But in a lot of books now, they get derailed into the subject of, like, for example, CSS and HTML. And then you can't really pass through it because you don't really know if there's going to be a really useful point about PHP or Rails or something coming up. Mostly it's just that it will take you a bit longer than a usual person, and it will require a lot more persistence and a lot more self-awareness. Most of it is because, as I said, you have to figure it out yourself most of the time.
Did you find any online communities or any resources or any specific learning materials aimed at people who were visually impaired?
No, not really. Most of it is because I went into a field where blind people don't usually go. So once I started learning about programming, I found that there are people, for example, working at Google who are blind developers, and they're, for example, working on the search engine with C++. But what I was very interested about at that point was web development. And this was something that no one had done professionally before. I mean, you had a lot of people who were just playing around on their own computer, but no one that was doing this in an effort to find a job. So for me, it was mostly me and Stack Overflow and like books. But mostly it was, I didn't have anyone on hand even to ask all those questions from. For me, it took like 4 years or so to get to a point where I was like, okay, now I'm confident enough to go get a job. But for someone nowadays, it probably takes 1 or 2 months to get like started enough to go and work as a full stack developer.
So it sounds like you were a bit of a trailblazer. You were one of the first people who were going to come into this web space. You were going to build as a blind developer, and that you kind of had to make your own materials or make the materials that exist work. If you were going to say something or share some advice with someone writing a technical book or someone writing a tutorial, what would you encourage them to think about to make their materials more accessible?
This is really a great question, and mostly because a lot of people, when they think accessibility, they think, oh, now I have to do a ton of work. And mostly the reason you think about accessibility this way is because there is not enough awareness. But once you actually understand what accessibility is and what facilities blind people or like other kinds of people with other kinds of disabilities have, you realize, oh, it's actually not that hard. To give you an example, because tutorials and technical books are an awesome example, as you said, I see a lot of tutorials on the internet. They are getting a bit less now, but like they are using a lot of screenshots. So like, for example, instead of me pasting a code snippet, now what I do is like I just take a screenshot of that code on the screen, or I take a screenshot of the window of my IDE saying like, okay, if you want this to work, here is what you have to do, image. And stuff like this is mostly very annoying.
Yeah, I can imagine where you're like, okay, I've got this point. Oh, it's just a big image.
Yes. And because like sometimes it's just this single block. I've searched a lot and I'm like, oh, finally I found this. Oh, it's an image. But it's mostly that common sense, being that, like, for example, a lot of people have found that if they, instead of putting stuff in images, if they put it on their blog as an actual text, it helps them be found even more because Google now has the ability to index that piece of code. So if anyone is searching for that error, if anyone's searching for that line of code, there is a very high chance that people get to their blog. So this is actually being reduced a lot, courtesy of Google. But I still have a lot of these websites where you have a lot of screenshots, or like books where you probably have seen a lot of these as well, where they talk about something, and because they don't want to actually explain step by step how to do something, they just check all the boxes and remove all the fields that you don't need and just post in a screenshot there. This usually happens when you want to explain how to, for example, work with Salesforce. So what you do is like, so here is my options page in the Salesforce app, and then screenshot. Mostly, these are the biggest problems. One of the other problems is people sometimes get derailed. This is also happening much less now, but when I was getting started in 2009 and 2010, you had this a lot where a book written about PHP or Ruby or, like at the time, Python, they would suddenly get derailed into all this technology. It's like HTML and CSS and stuff that you didn't care about. But nowadays, with the emergence of web services and actual backend systems that are just APIs, a lot of these books are now just focusing on one technology because there's just so much more depth to them nowadays than it used to be. So as things get a bit more complicated, just so that people have to cope with this, a lot of these problems I am talking about are disappearing. But when you are including any kind of image, or when you're talking very much about visual things in a book where it's targeted toward a non-visual field, that is usually a problem. And one thing I, for example, had to go with this, to give you a better example of non-visual and visual. So I'm originally from Iran. And one of the only ways I had for getting out of Iran was to get hired as a developer in a company that is outside Iran, and do that in a company which is big enough to actually relocate me. The problem with these tech companies is that they get so many interview applications that they have something like HackerRank or Codility or something similar.
Oh, no, I
Yes.
hate HackerRank so much.
Yes.
HackerRank, is it very accessible?
And no, it's not really accessible, Mel.
Now I have a good excuse for hating it.
Yes.
Now I have another good excuse for hating it.
But like the bigger reason I actually don't like the concept of HackerRank, which is probably the same reason you don't like it, is because it's just a mindless way of testing someone that is like not really based on anything but their ability to memorize some certain way of doing something, or like some certain way of solving problems.
Exactly.
Yes. And the problem with that certain way of doing things is that it's all explained visually. So like if you search for how are hash maps implemented, you will see a lot of posts about how hash maps are implemented in memory. And all of them have examples of the memory system in blocks that are like images. Imagine a memory is like this, image. So if you want a hash map, it's like this, image. So the whole industry of algorithms and how you solve CS 101 problems that you have to pass to get through an interview, they were all very visual. So for me, it took a really, really long time. And the only reason I could actually get through it was that I started to get in touch with a startup that was focusing on teaching people how to pass coding interviews. I'm not sure if I can mention their name here.
You're so welcome to if you want to.
Yeah,
I'm excited to hear who's doing that.
The website is called interviewcake.com. The person who started the website used to be, or maybe still is, an interviewer in Google. And because they were just getting started, once I sent them an email saying, hey, you also have a lot of images. Can you please explain the images above or below the image? Actually, just explain the image as well. Once you have an image saying, hey, here is the memory, it's like the reason it's there is because it's making a point. Just explain that point below in textual form. So like, for example, we have 8 blocks and then 4 of these blocks are filled, but the other 4 are empty and blah, blah, and all that stuff. So like, because he was just getting started, he was really happy to do this. And this actually helped me get past all those learning blocks of, okay, so this is actually what they meant. Oh, this is how actually this works. That helped a lot. And for him, it was just as easy as below the image, put an explanation of what the image is showing. I don't care if it's showing the memory blocks in rectangles or squares, but what I care about is why is it there? Like, what is it trying to say? It's trying to say that like half of your memory is filled with stuff that you don't really need. It's junk. Like, for example, that's what accessibility actually means. Because like when you talk about accessibility, a lot of people come up with really complicated solutions. Oh, should I make an AI that will look at the image and insert irrelevant text in the alt tag? I'm like, wait, what? No.
Just put in your alt text.
Yes. And like, just answer the question, why? Like, why is this here? What am I trying to say with putting this piece of image here? That's mostly it. That's it. It's pretty simple.
So this is fantastic advice for people building learning materials. You talked about the need to not just throw things up in images and a need to stay focused, to stay on track, to not be telling me about Python and then go, well, let's go on this little side quest and talk about CSS for 45 minutes.
Yes.
So stay focused and stop putting things in images, which are essentially black boxes for people who can't access them.
Yes. And I do understand that images can speak 1,000 words. But once you put an image, it would be great if you could also not explain things in 1,000 words, but at least do 100.
You're like, you don't have to give me 1,000 words, but like a couple, come on. What kind of advice would you give someone? What advice would you give to yourself, maybe? 5 or 10, or I don't think you're old enough to be giving yourself technical advice 15 years ago.
Yeah. Dating advice, maybe, but coding advice, no.
You'd be like, well, here's my dating advice. Let me give you some coding advice. You'll care in a couple of years.
Yes.
What kind of advice would you give a visually impaired person who's interested in learning to code today, who wants to get started?
I think this is the kind of advice you hear all over the internet, and something that has been said so much that has lost its meaning and its value. But I don't know. I don't really have a much better way of saying it, but like, persistence is key. The problems that I just talked about, it's been there for years, and you can't really wait for anyone to come and solve them. I mean, like, for example, let's say that 1 million people start listening to this episode, for example, and then 100,000 of them start taking action. You still have 900,000 people not taking action. All those 900,000 people could be producing information that is very much required for someone who is just getting started. So one thing that is, I think, the most important skill, and I was actually talking about this earlier with one of my colleagues, I think the most important skill for a blind person in general is resilience. Like, you are going to hit roadblock after roadblock all the time. And you just have to just barrel through, reach out and ask questions. Like, Stack Overflow is a really great option. You can, in your question, say, please don't put up images. And or like say, hey, I don't want to really care about this part. Can someone explain why this works or how that works and stuff like that. And there's also a lot of forums that are springing up all around the place. At the time I was learning, I didn't have I was in Iran. There is still no boot camp or any code camps or whatever you call them. Coding boot camps, maybe like a couple of both. Or like maybe going in person to a coding boot camp and talking to someone who could customize a program for you or go through it with you would be super helpful, because they can see in practice what you can do and what you can't do. And here is the truth. As a blind person, the first time someone gets to meet you, the first thing that goes through their mind is like, oh, they probably can't do much or anything. You have to get through that thought to be able to be constructive. So like any teacher, you have to first show your teachers that you are capable, and then after that point, they will start being more helpful toward you. So all of this takes a lot of persistence. You have to show people that you're into this and you're going to be there for the long run. And this is why a lot of people are giving up, because like the initial stages are pretty hard, much harder than for someone who can see. And all you need to be really, really careful about is to just stay around and keep on pushing and keep on trying. And at the time I was starting, I didn't really have much help. But nowadays, the number of people who are developers and are blind, that's increasing. And you can always just reach out to us, reach out to me, for example. I have a lot of blind people reach out to me who want to start just coding. The fact that you have someone who's blind who can give you advice on where to get started is pretty useful.
Parham, if somebody did want to reach out to you and say hello, where's the best place for them to find you?
Yeah, my website is parhamdoustdar.com. That's my name. And my email is me@parhamdoustdar.com. I can either spell that, or if you can put the links there in the description, I will just let it be.
No worries. We'll go ahead and add a link to the show notes with your website. Parham, thank you so much for your fantastic advice. And thank you so much for a reminder that those of us building learning materials or looking to hire into our companies could be doing and should be doing quite a bit more to make our learning material, our work, and our products more accessible. Thank you again.
Thanks a lot, Jessica, for having me. It was a really good pleasure to be here.
And thank you very much for joining us this week for the Pursuit podcast. Next week, we're going to be joined by the founder of Code Newbies, who's going to talk to us about the value of a community when you're learning to code or when you're learning anything new. If you want to find us online, we're on Twitter at @PursuitPod.